Hi, my name is John Chernesky. I'm the Plex Program Manager at the Praxis Spinal Cord Institute. Today, in your ongoing learning about user-centric design, we're going to talk about Plex engagement in medtech and some of the approaches that we utilize and how they can create more opportunities for you. So first, a little bit about Praxis. Our vision is a world without paralysis after spinal cord injury. We are a translational research institute working to identify, develop, validate, and accelerate the translation of evidence and best practices to reduce the incidence and severity of paralysis after spinal cord injury. We're trying to improve healthcare outcomes, to reduce long-term care costs, and to improve the quality of life for people living with SCI. And we do this through an integrated knowledge translation model where we integrate the voices of Plex to influence and shape the work that we undertake. So what is spinal cord injury? We define spinal cord injury as the most traumatic injury the human body can sustain and still continue to live. It affects every system of the body. And what is Plex? Well, Plex is an acronym that we coined for persons with lived experience. Persons with lived experience are not just the individuals that sustain the spinal cord injury, but the support network around them. This includes their family and friends, their care providers, as well as community and advocacy organizations that support them. We strongly believe that they all have a vital voice in helping to shape the work that we're undertaking. So what does spinal cord injury look like? I think it's obvious to most people that there's a motor paralysis aspect where you lose the ability to move parts of your body. But beyond that, you also can have reduced or impaired sensation, as well as a host of other systemic impairments, such as autonomic dysfunctions, which include bowel and bladder and sexual function. It can lead to respiratory compromise. It can affect your blood pressures and cardiovascular control, as well as lead to secondary issues such as spasticity, neuropathic pain, pressure injuries, and more. On average, an individual can experience up to 15 secondary complications at any given time. So let's go through a little background on engagement of persons with lived experience. Historically, health research and innovation has been done in isolation, with very little input from persons living with chronic health conditions like spinal cord injury, and little consideration for what their needs and priorities actually are. But attitudes have been shifting towards what is termed a patient-centered, patient-oriented, or patient-partnered approach. We're seeing that research funders are beginning to recognize that lived experience can add value to research and innovation, and often require lived experience partners on grants that they fund. The evidence is growing around best practices for how to meaningfully engage persons living with chronic health conditions. And as such, new tools and resources are being created to guide researchers and innovators and persons living with chronic health conditions on how to work effectively and meaningfully together. But inadvertently, tokenism does continue to be prevalent. So, planning a strategy for meaningful engagement will help you to mitigate this inadvertent tokenism and lead to greater impact in your work. So what are some of these principles that we look to in meaningfully engaging persons living with chronic health conditions? Well, first, experience equals expertise. Not all knowledge comes with an MBA or an MD or a PhD. A lot of times, living with a chronic health condition like spinal cord injury, which I've been living with myself for over 30 years, it's 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. It doesn't leave when you go on vacation. It doesn't go away when you head home for the day. It's with you 24/7. So that leads to a high degree of understanding and knowledge and expertise about that health condition, which can benefit your work and help provide perspective that you might not get anywhere else. When you're engaging persons with lived experience of spinal cord injury or any other health condition, you should value their experience in a similar way to how you would value any other professional experience. It's important to recognize that experience with some form of compensation. That doesn't necessarily mean monetary compensation, but recognizing the value that they're adding to your work is important, and you should have conversations with your partners about what would work best for them. This all comes down to that fundamental concept of nothing about us without us. If you're looking to create an innovation for a group of individuals living with a particular health condition, they should be a part of helping to create that solution. And when you're engaging with these individuals, language is important. You want to make sure that you're using person first language. Things like this word wheelchair bound. I'm not bound by a wheelchair. A wheelchair is a tool of liberation. Without a wheelchair, I would be bound to a bed. I am a wheelchair user. As such, an individual who supports me in my day-to-day living is a care provider. And I am not a disabled person. I am a person living with a disability. You might not get this right the first time, and oftentimes we have to provide little subtle hints and nudges to people, and it's something you learn over time. But always taking a person-centered or person's first approach in your language and asking people how they prefer to be spoken to or spoken about can go a long ways to mitigating some of that faux pas in language. So, we mentioned briefly about tokenism. So what is tokenism? We define tokenism as when a person living with SCI or an organization representing them is asked to endorse and therefore legitimize research programs over which they have little influence or control. And it's important to recognize that if you're going to involve persons living with spinal cord injury in your work, that you seek to engage them in an honest and meaningful way, and that their voice has equal value at the table to any other expert you would engage. So now let's take a look at what engagement looks like in real life. In the early 1980s, the HIV and AIDS pandemic first started to emerge. It was first officially reported in 1981, and at that time, it disproportionately affected young gay men. In response to this, advocacy organizations were formed to try to better understand the condition and push forward health innovations to try to combat it. ACT UP was one of those first advocacy groups that was formed in 1986. Later, ACT UP was described as the most effective health activist group in history. Shortly after ACT UP was formed in 1987, the FDA approved the first drug to treat HIV. 2 years later, in 1989, it was estimated that there was 1 million people living with HIV in the US. And after a year later, the CDC reported that the mortality rate for HIV persons in HIV positive persons in the US was estimated at 16 to 21%. It was at that time the second leading cause of death among men in the United States aged 25 to 44. So you can understand why there was such a high degree of urgency given the high mortality rate, and it was just getting worse. These advocacy organizations realized that something needed to be done. And so protests were held against this lack of urgency in curative interventions and treatments for HIV and the limited funding that was being directed towards this pandemic. The protests that they held were loud and aggressive, and they made a lot of headlines, but they didn't create a lot of change. At that time, there was a lot of stigmatism against individuals with HIV and AIDS, and it was continuing to grow. Government regulators and funders and drug companies disregarded these activist protests. But the activists recognized that they needed to better understand the science to inform their advocacy efforts. At that time, these HIV and AIDS activists began to successfully advocate the FDA to allow combinatorial drug trials to advocate for increased NIH funding. Once they better understood the science, they understood what was being done, they came from a position of knowledge and were able to speak to the FDA, to regulators, to government, to funders in a language that they understood and they actually paid a lot more attention to. What we saw, though, was as that FDA change in their policy to allow combinatorial drugs to be tested, it dramatically increased the effectiveness and efficacy in suppressing viral load of HIV in individuals that had contracted it. This led to the first combinatorial antiretroviral drug cocktail being approved by the FDA in 1997. So let's look at what that impact was from these activists getting involved. Prior to their involvement and changing these perspectives of these various bodies, these drug tests were being done as a single drug at a time. But these activists worked with research funders, drug companies, and regulators to change the way that clinical trials were being conducted. By understanding and incorporating the perspectives of people living with HIV/AIDS, these clinical trials had dramatically higher levels of success. The current antiretroviral drug therapies can effectively eliminate transmissibility of HIV today. In 2019, it was reported that the risk of HIV transmission when HIV viral load suppressed is effectively zero. So what happened? Well, these activists had shifted their efforts over time to greater effect. At first, they were angry. They protested loudly. But then they got educated to understand the science. Once they understood the science and could make a meaningful contribution, they became influential. And once their influence started to shape the way that the research was being conducted, the science got better. So, ACT UP was loud and it was confrontational, but in the end, it was effective. So having that voice of people living with a chronic health condition like HIV helped to make the science better, led to greater impact, and created a world where HIV, now treated with the appropriate drugs, is a non-transmissible disease. This is the impact that engaging persons living with chronic health conditions can add to your work to make it focused, to make it appropriate, and to advocate that things can be done differently. Thank you.
The aim of Plex engagement for you as an innovator and a researcher is that they know what you don't and what you can't. You don't have the experience living with this chronic condition. You can hypothesize, assume, but you can't actually know what they're experiencing without engaging them in a way in which they feel valued, empowered to provide you with what they actually know and not just what they think you can hear or try and change your perspectives. You're really trying to answer the fundamental question, is your product, is your idea filling a real need in a meaningful way? When you're engaging Plex, you need to be asking the fundamentals. Understand what they know and what you don't. You want to integrate Plex engagement and influence at every level of your product and design development. When you're ideating what problem you're solving, when you're ideating every aspect of solving the problem of business development, you want to be engaging Plex to really ensure that what you're developing is going to have meaningful impact and result in a meaningful new product or service. Your goal of Plex engagement is really to identify challenges and opportunities early and often so that you can solve them, which will then present new challenges and opportunities early and often, and repeat this process through your Plex engagement. It's not about being the smartest, it's about being the most aware. Knowing the most isn't valuable. Having a structure in which individuals are providing you with effective information, effective ongoing feedback, that makes you the most aware of your product, your marketplace, and what kind of how individuals are actually going to be using the idea that you have. Ultimately, the aim of effective Plex engagement is becoming the convergence point for many people's knowledge. The benefits of Plex engagement are pretty self-explanatory from what I've been going into. There's really no such thing as talking to enough people that will be using your product. So, don't just survey. As I discussed earlier, create a feedback loop. Create a relationship with individuals who are Plex who can continue to give you ongoing feedback, creating that feedback loop and allowing your innovation to grow and become more effective. This is going to shape how you think about your product, how your company or even your team think about your product, how the users and the language your user thinks about your product, and how your language actually changes to be more Plex oriented as well. And by becoming that, you've actually changed how you're approaching your problems, how you're approaching future problems. Ask more questions. Ultimately, the more questions you ask, the more targeted advice you're going to get, and that will help feed into what new questions you need to be asking. Talk to people who don't know one another. One pitfall of effective community engagement is to ensure that you don't just talk to individuals who have the same issues or know each other and share the same predilections or same perspectives on a certain challenge. You really want to ensure that you're getting a wide variety of perspectives so that you can effectively integrate all of them into your innovation and solution. Ultimately, you're trying to avoid the pitfalls of groupthink. So now I just want to talk a bit about the value of inclusive product design. So inclusive product design is when it's prioritizing an integration of Plex engagement or Plex leadership in your product development. What you're doing there is you're valuing and giving Plex voices an important role in your product development pipeline. What you then end up doing is designing for not just the current state, but also the future state, which ensures that your product not only is meaningful, but has continued value and continued applicability. We see this, as I've discussed earlier, about health research projects really requiring Plex engagement. The reason for this is look forward. Look forward to what it's going to look like with this solution and how that's going to impact other future products as well. We see this on a governmental level with accessibility laws increasing. So making sure that you have Plex engagement is incredibly important, or keeping Plex in mind while you're doing any level of development of a product or service, that it's thinking forward to more and increased accessibility so that continue to be used. Another interesting case study to explore is the area of housing in British Columbia. Prior to 2018 and the rise of heat waves, we had fairly temperate year-round climate in the Pacific Northwest. No requirement or identified need for installing a lot of insulation in homes or ACs being installed everywhere. And context from a health perspective is that individuals with disabilities, with spinal cord injury or with MS, among other disabilities, they have difficulty with thermoregulation. They have impaired thermoregulatory systems within their body. So temperatures above 84 degrees Fahrenheit can become life-threatening, and that is not an exceedingly high temperature. Now, post-2018, currently, we see large numbers of individuals pass away in a week-long heat wave in BC, a massive response or a massive intention for response, because we've seen climate change result in colder winters and warmer summers. And, the immediate solution is fund portable ACs, fund a short-term solution that is going to increase climate change, but isn't really solving ultimately the problems that individuals with disabilities have. A portable AC in a small apartment unit is quite burdensome in terms of getting around one smaller apartment, which is a lot of British Columbia. So really it's about when you see a problem or when you think a problem might be coming, work with the community to develop a solution, but also be thinking ahead to where your community, where your ecosystem is going in 5 to 10 years, because that's where you want to be. The value of inclusive product development is that you're really trying to design products and services for everyone. We can't stress enough just how important it is to make inclusive design a priority. By not having inclusive design, people are going to hack your product. Users will adapt a design so that it meets their needs. Case study in the SCI community is a lot of individuals have hacked their power chairs to add rain protection or add a charger, or they've done multiple things that the current product that they live in, day out, doesn't do, so they've hacked it so that it works for them. They've personalized it for them. Case study as well is to think of street design. If you have a street that's designed for all users, because all users need a way to travel from point A to point B, they'll use the design that you've used with a sidewalk or accessible or bike lane. But if we don't think, well, where is a power wheelchair or a power wheelchair that can go quite fast with a assistive device, where are they meant to go? Are they meant to be in the bike lane and maybe go faster or slower? Are they meant to be in the car lane? Or are they meant to be on the sidewalk? We've not identified A lot of streets don't identify spaces for all users, and so users are going to continue to use the space in the way that they think they should. And that does cause, if you talk to individuals with spinal cord injury, it increases their fear of travel on their own, and it increases their worry of can they get from A to B, especially when they're traveling and they're not aware of what's ahead. One thing we want to talk about a little bit is integrated knowledge transfer. And integrated knowledge transfer is kind of the fundamental principle of Plex engagement. It's integrating the knowledge transfer between someone with lived experience and someone else who doesn't have that lived experience, or a research project, or an innovation development. By making integrated knowledge transfer a priority, you're making Plex engagement a priority. You're really becoming a convergence of ideas and perspectives and knowledge. Groups, businesses, and organizations that integrate Plex throughout product and business processes have huge advantage. They'll have ongoing adaptability by increasing the systemic response of its operations. So if they see a change that's necessary for the product, or they see a change that's coming up within the ecosystem, they have an effective feedback loop built into their system to respond to it, iterate new ideas, respond to new challenges, and really work with the Plex community to find solutions for what's coming, but also being aware of what's coming. A lot of entrepreneurs and innovators will focus in on what their business needs and kind of forget or neglect what's going on around them. That's why having individuals who are part of these communities allows for you as an entrepreneur to hear what's going on within those communities. So you're always aware and always responsive to what's needed. The other is to really think about products and services that meet tomorrow's demands. Examples of this would be to look at the number of retrofits you're seeing in theaters where size and shapes of seats don't reflect what we need. We'll look at the car expo, the most recent car expo, where fewer gas-powered vehicles are there and a lot of transition to electric, seeing in the future that there's not only a demand but potential government regulation. Sometimes what you'll notice a frequency is that business is advanced beyond systemic regulations and preparing for the change that they see coming. One area where we would love to see a lot of change is actually with rental car companies, with the increase in more accessible vans and vehicles. One area that's challenging for individuals with spinal cord injury is the safety of transportation. Feeling safe when you get to a new location. Is there a vehicle there that you can use to get around? Is the public transit system safe enough? Are there Ubers that will be accessible to me? Very few rental car companies have very few cars, and that really dramatically limits the number of individuals who can travel safely to different cities or even across different countries. So ensuring that there is benefit to travel, ensuring that this can be done safely is going to improve the quality of life for individuals with spinal cord injury. Next, I want to transition to the 4 phases of human-centered product design. So kind of like looking at what are the principles behind what we just generally talked about. So we've got 4 phases: the discovery phase, the ideation phase, the development phase, and the evaluation phase of new products and services. So I'm going to briefly just talk about high level where Plex engagement can be integrated into these 4 phases. So in the discovery phase, really that's you as an innovator learning about Plex realities. We think you need to interview at least 25 people with your idea or your early prototype. Really, this is before you've got a prototype. This is where you're really talking to individuals who have this lived experience so that you can understand what their problems are. Or if you've identified an area that you want to develop a solution, you know what they're currently doing to solve that, what they're currently doing to work around it, how are they hacking the solutions that they're currently using, and really developing a journey map, different journey maps for all these different individuals. This is going to give you a much more fulsome perspective on the problem. While you iterate solutions to identified problems, you really want to engage the Plex community to challenge your assumptions. What assumptions did you make in developing that solution, in coming up with that solution? Where did you go wrong? Where did you go right? Where are the areas that you're maybe not understanding? Really, while you're iterating, you're coming up with a lot of questions that you want answered. So again, ask 25 plex, maybe the same plex. Ideally, a lot of the same individuals so they can see where you're coming from, see where you're going, and being a part of your journey the whole way through. That's really what effective plex engagement looks like. They're going to help you refine your solutions, identify opportunities for new solutions, and really ensure that you're leaving the ideation phase with a really strong idea and solution. Plex feedback is going to help you refine your solutions. They're going to help identify opportunities that are going to help your solution be more effective. Really, where the aim of Plex engagement during this period is to leave the ideation phase with a really fulsome solution to an identified problem that you came up with in the discovery phase. Throughout the development phase, when you're testing and prototyping your early designs and early ideas, you really want to maintain that effective Plex feedback loop that you developed in the first two phases. They're really helping you co-design not only your product, but also the engagement materials and the procedures that you're undertaking with Plex engagement. Individuals with lived experience are actually able to help you refine your own engagement processes, and that's going to make that even stronger. As well, testing your early prototypes with a diversity of Plex is going to show you how it's being used in the real world, how your product is going to be potentially hacked, as well as is it making a meaningful impact, or is it just a nice to have? That's really what you're looking for in this period, is to provide that effective validation of your product or service so that you're going into the next phase. Last phase is the evaluate phase, and this is where you're really looking at evaluating and piloting your minimum viable product, answering the fundamental question of, does it make meaningful impact in the real world? So as you're deploying the engagement materials that you've refined, you're ensuring and validating that what your product is solving is doing it in a way that is meaningful for individuals living with spinal cord injury and their community and the other Plex individuals that this is impacting, as well as does it need a tweak or refinement of this? This is really where you're getting more nuanced. Is the packaging working? Or is every aspect of the way you've developed what you're doing next? You've done your clinical trials and now you're trying for market adoption. Are the clinicians going to use it in an effective way? What are you hearing back? How does it need to change not only the product itself, but the way that it would be adopted within the market? By understanding this, you're able to really evaluate and effectively change your product. And ultimately, there is a question that some innovators will have, which is what happens through this end user engagement, it's then identified that it's not having a meaningful impact. Well, that's where you go back to one of your previous phases and you reevaluate. Where did you go wrong? Where did you go into an area that meant that you weren't developing something that was going to have meaningful impact? Pivoting is really valuable for innovators, and having this really effective feedback loop, really effective engagement is going to ensure that you can pivot faster and more effectively. Next, I'm going to go through 3 case studies of companies that have gone through Praxis's Innovation Program, companies who have had their impact from the Plex engagement processes of our program. So the first is in the ideation phase. So a company, Starling Medical. Starling Medical is a US-based company focused on solutions for reducing UTIs for people with lived experience of spinal cord injury and other conditions that increase the susceptibility to urinary tract infections. When they came into our program, they came with a unique innovation of an indwelling catheter. And by working with our Plex team on a weekly basis for the 4-month program, they left with an idea for a new product. They went back to a previous phase and started iterating a new product. The company pivoted from a product in which an indwelling catheter would detect or could potentially detect UTIs to a toilet bowl collector to use the same science in a different format, as they heard from individuals living with spinal cord injury that this would be more important, more useful, more impactful for the way that they live their lives. Human Emotion Robotics is a Vancouver-based exoskeleton company that came to us really to validate their innovative exoskeleton. And really, when we work with companies, and when any accelerator works with companies, we really want you to challenge your assumptions. Test your product's use case, and really learn how end users intend to use your product. Not just how you intend them to use their product, but how they intend to use their product. What they heard from the spinal cord community was, while many individuals will want to use this at home, many more wanted to use it within rehab. They saw the benefits of something very responsive to the way that the lower limbs work to be able to effectively regain function. As we look back to the SCI journey, rehabilitation post-injury is really important for maximizing the regain of function. And one of the areas you could be doing this is with more effective rehabilitation technologies. So Human Emotion Robotics left our program and started pursuing more aggressively the rehab market, looking for clinical trials, and really showing that use by rehabilitation hospitals of the exoskeleton will have benefits to the regain of function for people living with spinal cord injury. Calgary-based company Nanotest has developed a nanotechnology gel that really improves standard of care when it comes to wound care. Later stage pressure wounds are one of the main leading causes of death for individuals living with spinal cord injury, and incredibly important that we have new solutions to this problem as identified by the community and as identified by clinicians. And so when they came to us, we really worked with them to review their packaging, their market entry, every aspect of how individuals with spinal cord injury find out about new technologies, how they adopt, what steps they take to adopt. Do they need to hear from their community? What kinds of information need to be conveyed to them or conveyed to clinicians in order for that adoption to be effective? So really, again, using a wide variety of different individuals with different lived experiences to provide valuable information for the market adoption of a later stage product. So now I'm just going to briefly go over kind of like some lessons learned from medtech commercialization that we've learned from our team and for our extensive network of mentors. First is that you know what you know. This is something we talked about earlier, but it really needs to be understood that you can't assume you know what is best for an individual, that only they can tell you what is most important to them. Fundamentally, learning is a lifelong pursuit. It never stops. Being an entrepreneur and being an innovator is always ensuring that you're continuing to learn. You understand that it's a lifelong pursuit and that it never stops. That's how you understand your market. That's how you understand your customer and the ecosystem you're going into. That you learn best from someone who's already done it is really important. Plex isn't just the individuals living with spinal cord injury. It's the individuals who've developed products for individuals living with spinal cord injury. It's individuals who've developed a new wheelchair adaptation. It's individuals who have some experience that is relevant to the problem you're solving. And to do that effectively, it's really to build a network, connect with people and organizations who have this experience. Conduct thorough needs assessments on every level, not just within the Plex community of people living with spinal cord injury, but also continue to engage people within the broader SCI community. Clinicians, whether they be PTs, OTs, MDs, a wider range of individuals who are going to be potentially using your product or have some influence over adoption of your product is really important to understand whether you're hitting the needs that they have, really understanding the needs that they have. And that we'll go into in a bit is really understanding the product ecosystem, as product ecosystems are made up of not just the system, but also individuals within that system. So understanding their needs is really important. And just a reminder, as we've talked about before, it's really to design inclusively. You design inclusively with Plex engagement. You're designing really with accessibility in mind, with longevity in mind. To effectively have your innovation adopted, you need to understand your product and services ecosystem. You need to identify the different key influencers, KOLs, and decision makers in that system and how they interact with each other. They each have independent motivators, needs, wants, decision-making frameworks. You need to identify within the medtech framework not just the individual user, but really go back up the chain. Who's paying for this product? Is it a private insurer? Is it the healthcare system? Who's selling it? Is it yourself? Is it a distributor? What's motivating each of these individuals and each of these groups? And what business factors have framed the way that they operate? Some distributors in certain areas are going to work and operate differently than with one product over another product. Really understanding those nuances is incredibly important for your market adoption. Who approves? Really discussing the regulator. That's pretty early on in your journey, but you also want to make sure that when you're looking at your regulator or your buyer, that anything that they require, such as certain claims on a clinical trial or certain assertions and assumptions, you want to be talking to your manufacturers. Again, really understanding what the nuances of the manufacturing and production of your product are so that you can identify problems early, identify what nuances of your product need to be integrated into early MVPs, and then ultimately put into the market and presented to manufacturers to effectively produce. Ultimately, a thing to keep in mind is the role of an ideator or an entrepreneur is to work within a system, not to change it. A common frustration with medtech entrepreneurs is the length of time it takes to move through all the regulatory hurdles and the reimbursement hurdles, and the adoption timeline is quite long. But that is the reality of the system in which you're operating. Understanding that system is really important to effectively navigate that system and move through it as fast as possible and effectively as possible. But it's not to change it. It's not your role to change it. It can be your role later, but for now, your focus is getting your innovation into the hands. If that requires a change within the system, build that into your business journey. Let others into that conversation because they're really going to help you understand what can be changed within that system and what can't be changed in the system, because if a product is not to market, it's not having the meaningful impact on individuals living with spinal cord injury. I'm really going to emphasize just a portion of what I just talked about, and that's understanding the motivations of each level of an ecosystem. Individuals at each level in an ecosystem are Plex. So it's part of your Plex engagement is to understand the motivations of each level. Now, case study of healthcare in US versus Canada. Really looking at the US where we're looking at private payers motivated by cost savings, easy-ish to increase premiums on their end. Some shared systems of adoption within the reimbursement systems and the HCPCS code systems. Whereas in Canada, the government pays for primary care, so they can be motivated by political factors. Understanding what the different motivations between those systems are will allow you to better navigate each system individually. Treating two systems in the same way is an ineffective way to be adopted. You really want to tailor your adoption and procurement strategies to the area that you're focusing, whether that be on a regional district, whether it be on a provincial level. You really have to understand what's motivating the individuals who work within that system so that you can navigate and effectively have adoption within that system. Last few points on lessons learned for medtech commercialization is that 100 bad ideas are better than 0 good ideas, because you've had the opportunity to test them, to challenge them, to really understand the assumptions going into them so that your next idea will be the best idea. It's better to have a bunch of bad ideas that you've iterated out or you've developed prototypes, and then the one that you have is going to be really important. Lots of entrepreneurs don't come up with 20 inventions in their lifetime. They come up with a few really important, really meaningful technologies. And so you really want to get those bad ideas out so that you can have effective ideas move forward. To that end, it's never too late to change your mind. Pivoting is an essential quality of a startup because it means you're responsive to the needs of your end user or the needs of your market or needs of some area of Plex that you've engaged. What we've seen is that a lot of investors in this space also really evaluate pivot potential as an important metric. So having that capacity for learning and having the capacity to say when an innovation isn't working and when to move on and when to pivot over to a new innovation is a really valuable skill for all emerging innovators. One important part of business development for innovators is to ensure that the partners you're choosing have shared values. By prioritizing Plex engagement, you're prioritizing a certain value on end user engagement, on meaningful impact. And you want to ensure that your partners, your investors, your manufacturing partners, all have or share this similar value, because then they'll be able to pivot with you. They'll be able to change with you. They'll understand and support you as you move along your development chain. Individuals you bring into your team, educate them about what you've learned, what the effectiveness of this. Really strongly prioritize this value within your teams, and you'll see multitude of growths, because integrated Plex engagement, it's bi-directional shared learning. It's going back and forth between your team and individuals with lived experience. In the spinal cord injury community, NASCIC, the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium, the aim of NASCIC is to prioritize Plex leadership and Plex engagement throughout every level of innovation development. As such, they've launched the SCI Research Advocacy course that can be taken by researchers, individuals living with spinal cord injury, to really understand best practices for Plex engagement. We strongly encourage all innovators within the SCI community to take this course, to really understand and learn the fundamentals beyond this presentation of how to effectively engage Plex in the work that you're doing. I always like to bring it back to why we do what we do. Understanding that small innovations can make a big difference. Innovations that we would see and perceive as small could be monumental to individuals living with spinal cord injury or other chronic conditions. So really understanding just how much monumental impact we could be having with the work we're doing makes it all worthwhile. Thank you.